The morning sun of Zephyria cast long purple shadows across the Crystal Palace as delegates from 47 different worlds gathered for the annual Galactic Youth Summit. Ben Rivera stood at the edge of the Grand Terrace, watching ships from across the galaxy land in perfect formation on the gleaming platforms below. Each vessel carried young representatives who would spend the next week learning about different cultures and building connections that might one day prevent wars between their worlds. Ben adjusted his simple blue uniform and checked his translator device one more time. At 28, he was older than most delegates, but Earth had chosen him specifically for his calm nature and ability to handle difficult situations. His brown hair was neatly combed, and his dark eyes held the patient look of someone who had spent years working with people from different backgrounds. The Crystal Palace was a marvel of Zephyrian architecture. Tall spires reached toward the sky like frozen lightning, and the walls seemed to shift color depending on the angle of the light. Everything was designed to impress visitors and remind them of the ancient power of the Zephyrian Empire. The floors were made of polished stone that reflected the ceiling art above, creating the illusion of walking through space itself. Ben had read about Zephyrian culture during his 6-month preparation for this summit. They were a proud warrior race who valued honor above all else. Their society was built around complex rules of respect and challenge. To insult someone was to invite a formal duel. To back down from a challenge was considered worse than death. Their young were trained from childhood to defend their family name with both words and weapons. The summit's opening ceremony was about to begin in the Hall of Worlds, a massive circular room that could hold thousands of beings. Ben made his way through the corridors, nodding politely to other delegates he passed. A group of crystal-skinned Altarians waved at him with their 4 arms. 2 furry Canopians chittered a greeting in their musical language. Everyone seemed excited about the week ahead. As Ben entered the Hall of Worlds, he stopped to admire the sight before him. The ceiling was a perfect dome that showed a live image of the galaxy spinning slowly overhead. Hundreds of seats were arranged in circles, with each world's delegation sitting together. Flags and banners from every species hung from the walls, creating a rainbow of colors and symbols. The human delegation sat in a section marked by Earth's blue and green flag. There were 12 humans total, mostly university students who had won competitions to attend. Ben was their official guide and protector, responsible for their safety and for representing Earth's interests. The young humans chattered nervously among themselves, pointing at the strange aliens around them and whispering about what they had learned in their study sessions. "Look at those ones with the tentacles," whispered Sarah, a biology student from New York. "I read they can change color to show their emotions." "And those bird people can actually fly in low gravity," added Tom, an engineering student from London. "Their bones are hollow like ancient Earth birds." Ben smiled at their excitement. This was exactly why the summit existed, to help young minds see that the galaxy was full of wonders, not threats. He had been the same way during his first off-world mission 5 years ago. The universe was so much bigger and more interesting than most humans could imagine. A deep horn sounded across the hall, and everyone fell silent. The ceremony was beginning. From a hidden entrance, the Zephyrian royal family emerged. King Vorthan walked first, his silver armor gleaming under the lights. He was followed by Queen Zelta, whose crown seemed to be made of captured starlight. Behind them came their son, Prince Keth. Prince Keth was 17 years old and already taller than most adult humans. His skin was the pale blue color of ice, and his white hair was styled in the traditional warrior's knot. His eyes were the deep red of rubies, and they moved constantly around the room as if looking for threats or challenges. He wore a simple black uniform with his family's symbol, a lightning bolt crossed with a sword, on his chest. Ben had read Prince Keth's file during his preparation. The young prince was known for his quick temper and his skill with traditional weapons. He had already fought 3 formal duels, winning all of them. Zephyrian nobles often tested their children by putting them in difficult social situations, and Keth had never backed down from any challenge. Some reports suggested he actually looked for excuses to prove himself. The royal family took their seats on a raised platform at the front of the hall. King Vorthan stood and raised his hand for silence, though the room was already completely quiet. His voice carried clearly through the translator system. "Welcome, young beings of the galaxy," the king began. "You gather here not as enemies, but as the future leaders of your worlds. What you learn this week may shape the next century of galactic peace." The king's speech continued for several minutes, covering the history of the summit and the importance of understanding between different species. Ben listened carefully while keeping an eye on his human delegates. They seemed appropriately respectful and interested. When the king finished, it was time for the traditional cultural exchange ceremony. Each delegation would present something unique about their world and their people. It could be a song, a dance, a piece of technology, or simply a story. The presentations were meant to help everyone learn about the diversity of galactic civilization. The first delegation to present was from Altair Prime. They demonstrated their ability to create complex crystal sculptures using only their natural bioelectric fields. The crystals grew in impossible spiraling patterns that sang when touched by light. The audience gasped in wonder as the Altarians shaped what looked like frozen music. Next came the Canopians with their harmonized singing. Their voices could reach frequencies that most species could not even hear, creating melodies that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Even through the translators, the emotional power of their music brought tears to many eyes. One by one, each delegation shared something special. The Rigelians showed their ability to manipulate gravity in small areas, making objects dance in midair. The Vegans demonstrated their telepathic communication by having conversations without speaking aloud. Each presentation was met with respectful applause and genuine interest. Finally, it was Earth's turn. Ben stood and walked to the center of the hall with his delegates following behind him. He had chosen to keep their presentation simple but meaningful. The humans would share something that made their species unique, their ability to work together despite their differences. "Honored beings," Ben began, his voice steady and clear. "Humans come from one small world, but we are not one people. We have different colors, different languages, different beliefs. For much of our history, these differences divided us. But we learned that our diversity makes us stronger, not weaker." The human delegates arranged themselves in a circle. Each began speaking in their native language: English, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, Swahili, Hindi, Russian, and others. They were all saying the same thing: "We are different, but we are one." As they spoke, their voices blended into a harmony that needed no translation. The meaning was clear from the emotion and rhythm. The presentation was simple compared to the technological marvels shown by other species, but it had a power all its own. Many delegates seemed moved by the idea that beings could unite despite their natural divisions. Ben felt proud of his species and his young companions. As the humans returned to their seats, the applause was warm and genuine. Ben felt the ceremony had been a success. Earth had made a good impression, and the week ahead looked promising. He was already planning which cultural sites to show his delegates and which species might be most interesting for them to meet. But as the applause died down, Prince Keth stood from his place on the royal platform. This was not part of the planned ceremony. The hall fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. There was tension in the air that had not been there before. The young prince walked down from the platform and stopped in the center of the hall. His red eyes fixed on Ben with an intensity that made several nearby delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. When Prince Keth spoke, his voice carried the trained authority of someone born to rule. "Honored delegates," the prince began, "we have seen many wonderful presentations today. We have learned about the abilities and cultures of our galactic neighbors. But I feel I must speak about what we just witnessed from the humans." Ben felt a chill run down his spine. The prince's tone was formal but contained an edge that suggested trouble ahead. Around the hall, delegates leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Prince Keth continued, his voice growing stronger. "The humans speak of unity and cooperation. They present themselves as beings who have overcome their differences. But what they do not tell us is what their species truly is. The silence in the hall became absolute. Even the air circulation system seemed to have stopped making noise. Ben could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him, waiting to see how he would respond to whatever was coming next. Humans, Prince Keth declared, his voice echoing off the crystal walls, are nothing more than primitive scavengers. They crawl through space in their crude ships, taking technology they are too simple to invent themselves. They speak of peace and cooperation because they are too weak to fight properly. They have no honor, no courage, no true strength. The prince paused to let his words sink in. When he continued, his voice was filled with contempt. They do not belong among the civilized races of the galaxy. They are unworthy of citizenship in our great community. They should return to their little blue world and leave real exploration to species that have earned the right to travel among the stars. The words hit Ben like physical blows. Around the hall, delegates sat frozen in shock. Some looked angry at the prince's rudeness. Others seemed confused about what was happening. The human delegates behind Ben were pale with embarrassment and hurt. In Zephyrian culture, such an insult could not be ignored. The prince was deliberately challenging Ben to respond. Everyone in the hall knew the traditional options. Ben could apologize and accept the insult as truth, which would humiliate all humans present. He could challenge the prince to a formal duel, which a diplomat was not trained for and would likely lose badly. Or he could respond with his own insults, starting a verbal battle that could escalate into violence. Ben stood completely still as the prince's words echoed in his mind. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears and taste copper in his mouth. The young human delegates behind him were waiting for him to defend their species and their world. The other galactic delegates were watching to see if humans were truly as weak as the prince claimed. Prince Keth stood with his arms crossed, a slight smile on his pale blue face. He clearly expected Ben to either grovel or challenge him. Either response would prove his point about human weakness or foolishness. But Ben Rivera had spent years learning about conflict resolution. He had studied dozens of species and their customs. He had mediated disputes between mining companies and indigenous populations on frontier worlds. He had learned that sometimes the strongest response was no response at all. Ben looked directly at Prince Keth for a long moment. Their eyes met across the space between them. The prince's red eyes were filled with arrogant challenge. Ben's dark eyes were calm and thoughtful. For several seconds, neither moved nor spoke. Then Ben did something that no one in the hall expected. He turned around. Without saying a single word, he began walking toward the exit. His footsteps on the polished floor were the only sound in the entire massive hall. He did not look back at the prince. He did not acknowledge the gasps of surprise from the audience. He simply walked. The human delegates stood frozen for a moment, then quickly followed their guide. They walked in a tight group behind Ben, their own faces showing confusion but determination to support their representative. Their footsteps joined Ben's in a steady rhythm that echoed off the crystal walls. Prince Keth stood in the center of the hall with his mouth slightly open. This was not how insults were supposed to work. In Zephyrian culture, every challenge demanded a response. The prince had never encountered someone who simply refused to play by the established rules. "Wait," Prince Keth called out, his voice cracking slightly. "You cannot simply leave. You must respond to my challenge." Ben did not turn around. He did not slow down. He continued walking toward the exit as if the prince had not spoken at all. Behind him, the human delegates followed in perfect formation, their eyes forward and their backs straight. The hall erupted in confused murmurs as delegates from dozens of worlds tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Some thought the human was showing cowardice by running away. Others wondered if this was some unknown human custom. A few began to suspect that the human's response was more sophisticated than it appeared. King Vorthan stood from his throne with a concerned expression. Queen Zelta placed a hand on her son's shoulder as the prince stood alone in the center of the hall, staring at the exit where Ben and his delegation had disappeared. Ben Rivera walked out of the Hall of Worlds without a backward glance, leaving behind a room full of questions and one very confused teenage prince who had just learned that not everyone would play his game. The news traveled faster than any starship could fly. Within hours of the ceremony, reports of the incident were spreading across the galactic communication networks. Every major news service picked up the story, and social media platforms buzzed with debates about what had happened in the Hall of Worlds. On the mining colony of Kepler 442b, a group of Rigelian workers stopped their drilling operations to watch the recorded footage on their portable screens. They replayed the moment when Ben Rivera simply turned and walked away, analyzing every detail of his movements and facial expressions. "Look at his shoulders," said Foreman Gex, pointing at the screen with one of his 4 arms. "No tension. No fear. He was completely calm." "But that makes no sense," replied his assistant, Vex. "The prince insulted his entire species. In our culture, such words would start a clan war." "Maybe that is exactly the point," Gex said thoughtfully. "Perhaps humans fight their battles differently than we do." Similar conversations were happening across hundreds of worlds. The Altarian Council of Elders spent an entire evening session discussing the implications of Ben's response. The Canopian Pack leaders held emergency meetings to debate whether humans had shown wisdom or weakness. Even the usually isolated Andromedan collective sent observers to study the recordings. On Zephyria itself, the royal palace was in chaos. Prince Keth had returned to his chambers immediately after the ceremony, but servants reported hearing him pacing back and forth for hours. The sound of furniture being moved and occasionally thrown echoed through the halls. The prince had never encountered anyone who simply refused to engage with his challenges. Queen Zelta knocked gently on her son's door late that evening. When no answer came, she entered anyway. She found Keth standing at his window, staring out at the stars. His white hair was disheveled, and his red eyes showed the strain of confusion and anger. "My son," the queen said softly, "you have been troubled since the ceremony ended." Keth turned to face his mother, his young face twisted with frustration. "He ran away, mother. I offered him a chance to defend his honor, and he simply ran away like a coward." "Did he though?" Queen Zelta asked, sitting gracefully on the edge of her son's bed. "I have been thinking about what happened, and I am not certain we understand what we witnessed." "What is there to understand?" Keth snapped, beginning to pace again. "I challenged him. He fled. It is simple." "Nothing involving other species is ever simple, my dear one," the queen replied. "Remember your lessons about the Andromedan first contact. Our ambassadors nearly started a war because they did not understand that Andromedans consider direct eye contact to be an act of aggression." Keth stopped pacing and looked at his mother. "Are you suggesting that the human's cowardice is actually some kind of cultural custom?" "I am suggesting that we may not understand what happened as well as we think we do," Queen Zelta said carefully. "Perhaps it would be wise to study human customs more closely before drawing conclusions." But Prince Keth was 17 years old and had never been ignored before in his life. The idea that Ben Rivera had dismissed him without a word burned in his mind like acid. He had spent years training for moments like this, learning the formal responses to challenges and insults. Ben's silence had broken every rule Keth understood about how conflicts were supposed to work. Meanwhile, in the Royal Library, a team of scholars was frantically researching everything they could find about human psychology and culture. The head librarian, an ancient Zephyrian named Morthek, had spent the entire night reading through diplomatic reports and anthropological studies. "Your Majesty," Morthek said when King Vorthan arrived the next morning, "I have found some interesting information about human behavior patterns." The king settled into a reading chair while Morthek spread data tablets across a nearby table. "Tell me what you have learned, old friend." "Humans appear to have developed something they call emotional intelligence," Morthek began, adjusting his reading crystals. "It is the ability to understand and control their own emotions while also reading the emotions of others. Many species have such abilities," King Vorthan said with a frown. "The Betazoids are telepathic. The Signon are empathic. Yes, but human emotional intelligence is different, Morthek continued. They use it not for communication but for strategic advantage. They can choose not to respond to emotional manipulation. They can refuse to let others control their reactions. The king leaned forward with interest. You believe the diplomat was demonstrating this ability? I believe the diplomat recognized that your son was trying to provoke a specific reaction, Morthek said carefully. By refusing to provide that reaction, he maintained complete control over the situation. King Vorthan sat back in his chair and considered this information. If the scholar was correct, then Prince Keth had not achieved a victory over a coward. Instead, he had been outmaneuvered by someone who understood conflict better than he did. Across the galaxy, on a space station orbiting the neutron star Vela X, a group of interspecies diplomats was having a heated debate about the incident. The station served as a neutral meeting ground where representatives from different worlds could discuss trade agreements and territorial disputes. Ambassador Thren of the Capellan Unity was reviewing the footage for the 15th time. I have been studying this human's behavior, and I believe we are witnessing a new form of diplomatic strategy. How can silence be a strategy? Asked Commander Zelka of the Orion Defense Force. He said nothing. He did nothing. He simply left. Exactly, Ambassador Thren replied, pausing the recording at the moment Ben turned away. Look at the prince's face. Look at the confusion in the hull. The human achieved his objective without firing a shot or speaking a word. What objective? Commander Zelka demanded. He demonstrated that Prince Keth's insults had no power over him, Thren explained. In doing so, he made the prince look foolish and childish. Now everyone in the galaxy is talking about the incident, and most of them are questioning the prince's wisdom, not the human's courage. This was true. On news programs across dozens of worlds, commentators were debating the meaning of Ben's response. Most were coming to the conclusion that the human diplomat had shown remarkable self-control and strategic thinking. Dr. Yenna Forth, a Centaurian expert in interspecies psychology, appeared on the popular show, Galaxy Tonight, to discuss the incident. Her blue tentacles gestured expressively as she spoke to the host. What we witnessed was a perfect example of what humans call, taking the high road, Dr. Forth explained. Rather than descending to the level of insults and challenges, the human diplomat chose to maintain his dignity. But doesn't this encourage others to insult humans without consequence? Asked the host, a crystalline being from the Triangulum galaxy. Quite the opposite, Dr. Forth replied. The prince has been made to look petty and immature. His insults have backfired completely. I suspect other young nobles will think twice before attempting similar provocations. While the galaxy debated the meaning of his actions, Ben Rivera was going about his normal life on Earth. He had filed his incident report with the diplomatic corps and answered questions from his supervisors, but otherwise treated the entire event as a minor workplace annoyance. Ben lived in a small apartment overlooking Lake Geneva, where the Earth United Nations had their headquarters. Each morning, he would wake early and go for a run along the lakeshore. Today was no different, despite the fact that his name was being discussed on news programs from here to the Andromeda Galaxy. As Ben jogged past the early morning fishermen, he thought about the young humans who had been with him at the summit. They had been shaken by the prince's words, but Ben had spent the return journey helping them understand that other people's opinions could only hurt them if they allowed it to happen. The prince was trying to make us angry, Ben had explained during their flight home. Angry people make poor decisions. By staying calm, we kept control of the situation. But everyone will think we're weak, Sarah had protested, still upset by the public nature of the insult. Let them think whatever they want, Ben had replied with a gentle smile. We know who we are. That is what matters. Now, 3 days later, Ben was surprised to discover that most of the galaxy did not think humans were weak at all. His assistant, Maria Santos, had compiled a report of media coverage from across the known worlds. Look at this, Maria said, showing Ben her tablet as he arrived at his office. The Altarian Times called your response a masterclass in diplomatic restraint. The Regelian Defense Review says you demonstrated tactical superiority through non-engagement. Ben accepted a cup of coffee and glanced at the headlines scrolling across the screen. What about negative reactions? Surprisingly few, Maria admitted. Most commentators seem to think you handled the situation perfectly. There are some who call it cowardly, but they are mostly from warrior cultures that value direct confrontation. Ben settled at his desk and began reviewing his schedule for the day. He had 3 meetings with trade representatives, a conference call with the Mars Colonial Authority, and a diplomatic dinner with the Andromedan Observer Mission. It was a typical Tuesday in the life of an Earth diplomat. "Sir," Maria said hesitantly, "there have been some unusual communications requests." "What kind of unusual?" Ben asked, looking up from his schedule. 17 different news programs want to interview you. The Galactic Anthropology Institute wants to study your psychological profile. And the Zephyrian Palace has sent 3 separate requests for you to return for a formal meeting with Prince Keth. Ben sighed and set down his coffee cup. What does the palace want exactly? Maria checked her notes. The first message was an official invitation to discuss cultural misunderstandings. The second was a formal request for diplomatic dialogue. The third was marked urgent and asks for your immediate response to resolve an ongoing situation. Translation: The prince is having a public tantrum and wants another chance to provoke me, Ben said with a slight smile. That seems to be the general interpretation, yes, Maria agreed. Ben considered his options while finishing his coffee. He could ignore the messages, which would likely make the situation worse. He could send a formal diplomatic response through proper channels, which would take weeks to arrange. Or he could address the issue directly. Send a message to the Zephyrian Palace, Ben said finally. Tell them that Earth appreciates their concern, but that we consider the matter closed. Prince Keth is welcome to visit Earth if he wishes to engage in genuine cultural exchange. You want to invite him here? Maria asked in surprise. I want to give him the option, Ben corrected. If he truly wants to understand what happened, he will have to come and ask properly. No challenges, no insults, no royal demands. Just honest conversation between 2 individuals. While Ben was sending his diplomatic message, Prince Keth was becoming more frustrated by the day. The galactic news coverage was almost entirely negative toward his behavior. His own people were beginning to question his judgment. Worse, his father had ordered him to attend daily lessons on diplomatic sensitivity with the court's most boring instructors. The prince sat through another tedious lecture on the customs of the Andromedan Collective while his mind wandered to the human diplomat who had humiliated him simply by walking away. Every night, Keth replayed the scene in his mind, trying to understand where he had gone wrong. His instructor, an elderly Zephyrian named Master Tolven, noticed the prince's distraction. Your Highness, perhaps you would like to share your thoughts on the proper response to cross-cultural misunderstandings. I challenged him honorably, Keth said defensively. He should have responded. That is how these things are supposed to work. Master Tolven sighed deeply. He had been trying to explain basic diplomatic principles to young nobles for over 3 centuries, but Prince Keth was proving to be one of his most challenging students. Your Highness, what if I told you that by walking away, the human diplomat was actually responding? What if his silence was the most sophisticated answer he could have given? Prince Keth looked at his instructor with confusion. How can not answering be an answer? Consider this, you wanted to provoke him into anger or fear. Instead, he demonstrated that your words had no power over his emotions. Which of you appeared more in control of the situation? For the first time since the incident, Prince Keth began to consider that he might not have achieved the victory he thought he had. The possibility that Ben Rivera had outmaneuvered him through superior strategy rather than cowardice was deeply troubling to his self-image. That evening, Prince Keth received Ben's message inviting him to Earth. The prince read it 3 times, trying to find hidden insults or challenges in the simple words. There were none. The message was polite, respectful, and completely straightforward. For a young man who had spent his life learning to decode elaborate social challenges and formal dueling protocols, Ben's straightforward approach was more confusing than any complex diplomatic maneuver. The prince realized that he had absolutely no idea how to respond to genuine honesty. As word of Ben's invitation spread through the palace, it created a new wave of discussion among the court advisors. Some saw it as a diplomatic opportunity. Others worried it was a trap. King Vorthan listened to all the opinions before making his decision. "My son will go to Earth," the king announced during the morning court session. "He will learn what he failed to understand during the summit. Perhaps when he returns, he will be wiser." Prince Keth received this news with mixed feelings. Part of him wanted to refuse the invitation and maintain his pride. But a larger part was genuinely curious about the human who had defeated him without saying a single word. The prince had never met anyone who played by completely different rules than his own. The announcement that Prince Keth would visit Earth created another surge of galactic interest. News programs speculated about what would happen when the two met again. Diplomatic analysts predicted various outcomes ranging from friendship to renewed conflict. But Ben Rivera continued his normal routine, completely unaware that his simple invitation was being treated as the most important diplomatic event of the year. He went to work, attended his meetings, and planned for the possibility that a confused teenage alien prince might show up at his door looking for answers he had never bothered to ask before. The galaxy watched and waited to see what would happen when immovable human calm met unstoppable royal pride. 3 weeks after sending his invitation, Ben Rivera received word that Prince Keth would arrive on Earth the following Tuesday. The message came through official diplomatic channels and was signed by King Vorthan himself. It was formal and polite, but Ben could sense the underlying tension in the carefully chosen words. Ben was not particularly nervous about the meeting. He had dealt with difficult personalities before, and he understood that the young prince was probably more confused than angry at this point. The galactic media attention had likely taught Keth that his usual methods of handling conflict did not work with everyone. On the morning of Prince Keth's arrival, Ben was not waiting at the spaceport with cameras and ceremony. Instead, he was exactly where he could be found most Tuesday mornings, at the Riverside Community Garden in downtown Geneva. He wore old jeans and a faded blue shirt, and his hands were dirty from planting tomato seeds with a group of local children. The community garden was Ben's favorite place on Earth. It occupied a small plot of land between 2 apartment buildings, where families from dozens of different countries grew vegetables and flowers together. Children played between the rows while their parents worked, and everyone shared both the labor and the harvest. "Mr. Ben, why do we need to plant the seeds so far apart?" asked Emma, a 7-year-old girl whose family had moved to Geneva from Somalia. "Because plants need room to grow, just like people," Ben explained, showing her how to measure the distance between holes. "If we crowd them together, they compete for sunlight and water instead of helping each other. Like when my brother tries to sit too close to me during movie time?" Emma asked with a giggle. "Exactly like that," Ben said, smiling as he helped her press seeds into the dark soil. Around them, other volunteers worked in their assigned sections. Mrs. Chen from the Chinese delegation was teaching a group of teenagers how to build proper support structures for bean plants. Ahmed, a refugee from Syria, was showing newcomers which herbs grew best in Geneva's climate. Dr. Patel was leading a discussion about organic pest control while her twin daughters helped younger children water the seedlings. The garden was a perfect example of what Ben had tried to explain at the Galactic Summit, different people working together despite their varied backgrounds. No one cared about nationality or status here. Everyone just wanted to help things grow. Ben was explaining the basics of companion planting when his assistant Maria appeared at the garden gate. She looked slightly out of place in her business suit among all the casual gardeners, and she seemed nervous about something. "Ben," Maria called out, "you have a visitor." Ben looked up from the seed packets he was organizing and saw a familiar figure standing behind Maria. Prince Keth of Zephyria looked very different outside the formal setting of the Crystal Palace. He wore simple civilian clothes, dark pants and a plain shirt, but his pale blue skin and red eyes still marked him clearly as an alien visitor. The prince looked around the garden with obvious confusion. He had clearly expected to find Ben in some kind of official setting, perhaps an office or a formal meeting room. Instead, he was surrounded by ordinary humans doing ordinary work with their hands dirty and their clothes casual. "Prince Keth," Ben said calmly, standing up and brushing soil from his knees. "Welcome to Earth. I am glad you decided to visit." Several of the children looked up curiously at the alien visitor, but none seemed particularly alarmed. The community garden hosted visitors from around the world regularly, so they were used to seeing people who looked different from themselves. Prince Keth stared at Ben for a long moment, clearly struggling to reconcile this relaxed gardener with the diplomat who had walked away from his challenge. "You are Benjamin Rivera," he said finally, his voice uncertain. "Just Ben," Ben replied with a friendly smile. "Would you like to see what we are working on here?" This was not how Prince Keth had imagined their meeting would go. He had prepared for another formal confrontation, perhaps in a government building surrounded by security and protocol officers. He had rehearsed several different approaches depending on whether Ben tried to insult him in return or challenge him to some kind of human contest. But Ben was offering to show him a garden. The prince had no prepared response for casual friendliness. "I came here to demand an explanation," Prince Keth said, his voice carrying less authority than he intended. "You humiliated me in front of the entire galaxy." Ben nodded thoughtfully while continuing to organize his seed packets. "You feel that I humiliated you? Can you explain how?" "You walked away from my challenge," the prince said, his frustration beginning to show. "You refused to respond to my words. You made me look foolish." "I did walk away," Ben agreed. "But I think you made yourself look foolish. I just refused to help you do it." Prince Keth opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The human's calm tone and matter-of-fact manner were completely disarming. It was impossible to start a fight with someone who simply agreed with you while continuing to plant seeds. Emma tugged at Ben's shirt. "Mr. Ben, is your friend going to help us with the garden? Would you like to help us plant vegetables, Prince Keth?" Ben asked, gesturing toward an empty section of soil. "Emma here is teaching me about proper seed spacing." The prince looked down at the small girl who was smiling up at him with genuine curiosity. He had never been invited to do manual labor before, and he had certainly never been asked to learn from a child. His royal education had not prepared him for this situation. "I do not understand what is happening here," Prince Keth admitted, his voice quieter now. "Why are you not angry with me? Why do you not demand satisfaction for the insults I spoke?" Ben set down his tools and gave the prince his full attention. Around them, the other gardeners continued their work, but several were listening to the conversation with interest. "Prince Keth," Ben said gently, "can I ask you something? When you insulted humans at the summit, what did you want to accomplish?" The prince considered the question seriously. "I wanted to test your courage. I wanted to see if your species was worthy of respect." "And what would have proven our worth?" Ben asked. "If I had challenged you to a duel and lost. If you had accepted the challenge honorably, win or lose, it would have shown courage," Prince Keth replied. "I see," Ben said, nodding slowly. "So in your culture, the willingness to fight is more important than the reason for fighting." "Exactly," the prince said, relieved that Ben seemed to understand. "Honor comes from facing challenges, not from avoiding them." Ben picked up a small tomato seedling and examined its roots carefully. "That is an interesting way to see the world. But can I share a different perspective with you?" Prince Keth nodded, genuinely curious now despite his earlier anger. "In human culture, we have learned that some fights are not worth fighting," Ben explained. "We believe that true strength comes from choosing your battles wisely. Sometimes walking away from a challenge shows more courage than accepting it." "How can avoiding conflict show courage?" the prince asked, his confusion evident. Ben gestured around the garden. "Look at what we have built here. People from 30 different countries work together in this small space. They have different religions, different languages, different political beliefs. Do you know how we make it work? Prince Keth shook his head. We focus on what matters, Ben continued. Growing food, teaching children, building community. When someone tries to start an argument about politics or religion, we do not engage. We just keep working on things that actually improve our lives. Emma had been listening to the conversation with the intense concentration that children sometimes show when adults are discussing important topics. Mr. Ben, she said, is that why you did not fight with the mean prince at the space place? Ben smiled at her direct question. That is exactly why, Emma. Fighting with him would not have helped anyone grow. Prince Keth felt something shift in his understanding. He had spent his entire life believing that honor came from meeting every challenge head-on. But what if there were challenges that were simply not worth meeting? You are saying that you chose not to fight because fighting was pointless, the prince said slowly. I am saying that I chose not to let your emotions control my actions, Ben corrected gently. You were angry and wanted me to be angry too. But anger makes people do stupid things. So I decided to stay calm and think clearly instead. Mrs. Chen approached the group with a tray of herbal tea. Excuse me, she said politely, but I thought your guest might enjoy some refreshment. This tea helps with stress and promotes clear thinking. Prince Keth accepted the cup with automatic courtesy, but his mind was focused entirely on what Ben had said. The idea that someone could simply choose not to respond to emotional manipulation was revolutionary to his way of thinking. In my culture, the prince said, refusing a challenge is considered cowardice. In human culture, we have learned to distinguish between cowardice and wisdom, Ben replied. A coward runs from danger that threatens something important. A wise person ignores provocations that serve no useful purpose. Dr. Patel joined the conversation as her daughters continued watering plants nearby. If I may add something, she said to Prince Keth, humans spent thousands of years fighting wars over trivial insults and imagined slights. We nearly destroyed our own planet several times because young men like yourself thought honor was more important than survival. What changed? The prince asked, genuinely interested now. We learned that ego is expensive, Dr. Patel replied simply. Every moment spent defending your pride is a moment not spent building something useful. We decided to focus our energy on creation instead of destruction. Prince Keth sipped his tea and considered these words. Around him, the garden hummed with quiet activity as dozens of people worked together on projects that would benefit their entire community. Children played safely while adults shared knowledge and resources. There was no conflict, no competition, no attempts to prove superiority. Ahmed approached the group carrying a basket of fresh herbs. Would you like to try some mint? He asked Prince Keth. I grew it from seeds my grandmother brought from home 40 years ago. The prince accepted a small sprig and tasted it carefully. The flavor was fresh and clean, with a complexity that surprised him. This is very good, he said honestly. My grandmother always said that plants grown with patience taste better than plants grown with anger, Ahmed said with a smile. Maybe people are the same way. As the morning progressed, Prince Keth found himself drawn into the rhythm of the garden work. Ben showed him how to prepare soil for planting, and Emma taught him how to measure proper spacing between seeds. Dr. Patel explained how different plants supported each other when grown in the right combinations. The work was simple but satisfying in a way the prince had never experienced. There was something peaceful about focusing on practical tasks while having quiet conversations with people who had no interest in impressing or challenging him. Ben, Prince Keth said during a break from planting, I think I am beginning to understand what happened at the summit. Oh? Ben asked, settling down on a nearby bench. You were not afraid of me, the prince said slowly. You simply decided that I was not worth your energy. Ben considered this carefully. I would not say you were not worth my energy. I would say that fighting with you was not worth my energy. There is a difference. Explain the difference, please, Prince Keth requested. You are clearly intelligent and capable, Ben said. You cared enough about the summit to travel across the galaxy to attend. You have the potential to be a great leader for your people. But on that day, you were behaving like a bully who wanted attention. The prince flinched slightly at the word bully, but he did not argue. I could have given you the attention you wanted by fighting back, Ben continued. But that would have encouraged you to keep behaving that way. Instead, I chose to ignore the behavior while remaining open to the person underneath. Prince Keth sat quietly for several minutes, watching the humans around him go about their work. Children helped adults, adults taught children, and everyone shared whatever they had to offer. No one was trying to prove their superiority or defend their honor. They were all just focused on making things grow. I have never seen anything like this, the prince admitted finally. On Zephyria, everything is about competition and hierarchy. Everyone is constantly trying to prove their worth through challenges and tests. And how is that working for your people? Ben asked gently. Prince Keth thought about his home world with its constant political tensions, its elaborate dueling protocols, and its young people who spent more time learning to fight than learning to build. Not very well, I think, he said quietly. Emma ran over to show them a butterfly that had landed on her flowers. Look, Mr. Ben. It likes the colors we planted. That is wonderful, Emma, Ben said, admiring the delicate creature. Do you know why butterflies visit gardens? Because the flowers are pretty? Emma guessed. Because the flowers give them what they need, Ben explained. The butterfly gets food, and the flower gets help spreading its seeds to new places. They work together. Prince Keth watched the butterfly move from flower to flower with graceful efficiency. Cooperation instead of competition, he murmured. Exactly, Ben said. The garden succeeds because everything in it supports everything else. As the day continued, Prince Keth found himself asking more questions about human philosophy and culture. He learned about conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, and the concept of choosing battles wisely. He discovered that humans had developed these approaches not from weakness, but from hard experience with the costs of constant fighting. When evening came, the prince was reluctant to leave. The garden had given him a sense of peace he had never experienced before. More importantly, it had shown him an alternative to the competitive, challenge-based culture he had grown up with. Ben, Prince Keth said as the other volunteers began packing up their tools, I owe you an apology. I insulted you and your species based on ignorance and arrogance. Apology accepted, Ben said simply. We all make mistakes when we are young. I would like to learn more, the prince continued. About human philosophy, about emotional control, about choosing battles wisely. Would you be willing to teach me? Ben smiled and handed Prince Keth a packet of seeds. The garden is open every Tuesday and Saturday morning. Anyone who wants to learn is welcome to help. Prince Keth looked down at the seeds in his hand, small, simple things that contained the potential for growth and nourishment. I think I understand now why you walked away from my challenge. Why is that? Ben asked. Because fighting with me would have been like arguing with a storm, the prince said thoughtfully. Storms cannot be reasoned with or defeated. They can only be waited out or avoided. Very good, Ben said. And what happens after storms pass? Prince Keth smiled for the first time since arriving on Earth. You clean up any damage and get back to planting seeds. As they walked toward the garden gate together, Prince Keth realized that he had learned more about strength and wisdom in one day of gardening than in 17 years of formal combat training. The human who had defeated him without saying a word had just taught him that the greatest victories were often the quietest ones. The galaxy had watched this story unfold with fascination, but the real lesson was being learned in a small community garden where different people work together to make things grow. Sometimes the most powerful response to hatred was not anger, but the simple decision to focus on something better. Prince Keth returned to Zephyria with seeds in his pockets and new ideas in his mind. He would have a lot of explaining to do to his father, but he was no longer afraid of challenges that actually mattered.